that we set up certain objectives for us when we started the year, and we came up with certain targets. How have we fared vis-a-vis those targets? And I'd like to take you through that situation in terms of the presentation here. Now, if you see, in terms of the tax revenue, we have been short by 100 billion. And 31 billion is the direct tax, and 69 billion has been indirect tax situation. This is shared 69 by custom duty, excise duty, and sales tax, almost by 20 billion each. And that's the sort of the shortfall we have. This shortfall we have after a situation where we have an interim measure during the year, that certain interim measures were taken in March during the year, and 53 billion was supposed to be raised by those additional measures which were brought in by the interim SRO or whatever it was. So I was taking through you this particular reconciliation, that the target which was set up last year, that target actually have not been met by almost 153 billion rupees in terms of the tax revenue, if we take the direct and indirect together, and also take into account the measures which were taken during the year to address this particular situation. Why? One fact is pretty clear, that right after the budget was passed last year and the measures were brought in after the finance bill were converted into act, one thing was pretty clear, that the estimates were out even at that time, because the estimate of various increases in the government employees' salaries was not properly accounted for in the budget document anyway. So that was one of the reasons which was there, that we came up with the estimate, and that estimate was not correct even after 2 months or a month of the process of debate and the passage of the bill in the assembly. The other factor which is there is the non-tax revenue actually also fell by about 76 billion. We had problems with the taxes, we had problem with the petroleum levy, which was there, we were short by 9 billion there, and then there were problem in terms of the non-tax revenues, and that non-tax revenues was in relation to basically various receipts which were supposed to come but from various enterprises, government enterprises, in terms of the contribution or a dividend or a return coming to the government of Pakistan, and there was a shortfall of 76 billion there. And if we take this all, there was a shortfall of 176 billion in terms of the overall revenue. Now, on the other hand, one particular thing contributed, that is capital receipt. There was a contribution coming of about 134 billion from capital receipt, and that was coming in mainly from two particular elements, the permanent debt and the floating debt. These two funds of the domestic debt market, and the major one was from Sukuk fund, which was floated, and the Sukuk fund made a contribution of almost 140 billion plus. And that contributed in terms of 134 billion of a higher capital receipt which we have. So overall, if you see the whole situation, the net impact on the total revenue side was 52 billion. If you go to the expenditure side, there was a total difference of 298 billion. 298 billion difference in the current expenditure. And the one major factor which contributed to that was an increase in the subsidies, which was initially estimated 126 billion rupees. That's gone up to 268 billion, increased by 268 billion, and that basically has been a major cost increase which we have. In terms of the development expenditure, naturally the brunt, as always, fell on the development costs, and the development expenditure was brought down by a figure of 161 billion was a drop in terms of the development expenditure. Now, net impact on expenditure was 137 billion, and in that 137 billion, Basically, overall impact, if we add 52 billion shortfall in revenue, 137 increase in terms of the expenditure, the overall impact was 189 billion, and there was basically this 189 billion to be financed initially. But then one more thing happened, that we expected that we'll have external receipts of a particular amount coming in. That there's a shortfall in that receipt was 97 billion. What was that shortfall? Two major factors contributed to this shortfall. One was a Kerry Lugar contribution coming either as a grant or as a loan, and the other one was the expected funds from the Tokyo pledges, which were coming also either as grant or coming as the loan. And these two basically were short, and that resulted in 97 billion shortfall in terms of the external receipt. So the overall impact came up of 286 billion, and that 286 billion the government had to borrow from the banks. That was an increase in borrowing, and that increase in borrowing was 286 billion. Now, ladies and gentlemen, these were the objectives which were set up when the budget was presented last year. Objective was that we will protect the economic recovery by reinforcing the fiscal austerity. That was one objective, and I will try to show you what happened in this. This is the situation that as compared to the recovery which we were talking about, because the last year it was 3.7 or 3.8%, almost 3.8% GDP growth. Against that 3.8% GDP growth, the expectation was that we'll move to 4.5% GDP growth. Rather than going to 4.5% GDP growth, we fell short, and the overall growth in the economy was only 2.39%. And this is basically coming by virtue of shortfall in all sectors. It was agriculture, it was industry, it was services. All the three sectors came down. But the contribution which came in terms of this 2.9%, 90% contribution came from the services sector, and 10% contribution was the commodity producing sector. Now, that is something which has resulted when we said that we'll go and reinforce the recovery, strengthen our recovery. Rather than strengthening our recovery, we went into a situation where there was a shortfall. Then economy slided further down rather than going up. The other objective was check inflation and restrict borrowing from state bank. That was the second thing which we had as an objective which was there. Borrowing, I have already told you, there was an additional borrowing of 286 billion. And in terms of inflation, what we were expecting that against 11% inflation last year, we were expecting we'll go to the single digit and we'll go to 9% as a target. This happened. If you see the scenario, the April figure of the inflation was overall 14.08, and there is an expectation that the average inflation for the year 10-11 is going to be 15.5%, as against the target of 9%. And the worst part of that was that the component which was hit most was the food inflation, because the food inflation has been around over 18%, or 18.4% was the food inflation which was there and which contributed to the misery of the people. The third thing which we anticipated was reform and enhance social protection regime by innovative scheme, better targeting of the subsidies for the needy, and eliminating waste. Let us see what happened there. This is the position of the subsidy. We anticipated that the overall subsidy will be 126 billion. As against 126 billion, the subsidy was 396 billion, and the major contribution, about 89%, was by the energy sector, 296 billion for WAPDA, and 47 billion for KESC, and the rest was contributed with some other commodities which was there. So the major